My guests so far, Greg Amori and Dr. Jeffrey Spiegel, and I'd now like to welcome my next guest in, the Reverend Dr. Don Anderson with the Rhode Island State Council of Churches.
Good to be with you.
I appreciate your coming in today because we had a fascinating conversation this morning as it
Right.
pertained to the passing of Billy Graham at age 99. You're one of the foremost experts in religion in the state. I picked up the phone and said I wanted to call you up and just ask about his evangelical legacy, but clearly had a huge impact on all religions.
Well, there's no question that we have to understand each person in their context and time. And so if you look at the time when Billy Graham was really big in the 60s and 70s and moving into the 80s, he actually was an inclusive person, especially for someone coming from the evangelical camp. In fact, I grew up in a very conservative background, and we considered Billy Graham a liberal. So, you can get where I came from, right?
This is in the time context, absolutely.
And so because he would invite Catholic bishops and Episcopal bishops, who at that time, was just miles apart, and invite them to offer prayers on the platform and be part of the program. And so that was really pretty enlightening and very much ahead of its time.
So people, again, it's all the headlines today about his passing. So many folks have seen him on TV,
right.
And there's a lot of remembering his impact right now. But what do you think his legacy will be? Is it being at that forefront of that TV evangelical movement, or is it more than that?
So I think that when we really dig deep, there is more than that. Graham did and really pioneered in this modern way of doing these mass rallies all around the United States, starting with the rally in Los Angeles right after World War II. But the real impact, I think, of Billy Graham is on, number one, helping evangelicals to open their eyes to work with other people and be with other people. And also, one of the things that was happening during this era that a lot of people have forgotten about is there are a lot of what I would call fly-by-night evangelists who are just getting on TV or doing some of these things and raking in the dough and stuffing their own pockets with that money and not being careful with it. And so Graham was one of the leading founders of putting together an organization that still exists today that's called the Evangelical Council for Financial Responsibility. And they set up standards by which organizations should use for accounting, really demanded integrity. And so Graham led in that way. Up until his leadership, it really was a no man's land, and kind of everybody did was right in their own eyes, to quote the book of Judges. So it wasn't the greatest thing. So he did that. He wasn't perfect. I know there have been some stories today about his comments to Richard Nixon that were taped and verified when the tapes came out in 2002. I grieve at that and I cringe at that because so much of the work we do is with the Jewish community, and we love working with the Jewish community, and that is our a big part of what we do here in Rhode Island. So he's not a perfect man, and I think that he did apologize for that, and I accept that he was sincere, but it still was wrong. It was very wrong. And but he's human. One of my big grievings is that the direction of the organization since he stepped aside has been exactly the opposite. Where Graham was trying to always push the envelope to expand and be inclusive, the organization now led by his son Franklin is doing just the opposite. It's bringing things back narrow, and some very hateful things. What Franklin Graham has said, for example, about the Muslim community is absolutely outrageous and absolutely deplorable. And I have to believe that if Billy were alive and able to be active and engaged, that's exactly not the stance he would have taken.
So I do want to speak to that once we speak a little bit further about Billy's legacy. Why was he so popular?
Well, I think, he came about at a time when the country was just finishing World War II. He was the same age as many of these young men coming back. He was a combination of this kind of shy, southern, soft-spoken person, but who could really put a message together and talk to the common person. He didn't use a lot of highfalutin theological terminology. You know, he talked about real things from people's lives. And he was sincere. I mean, he believed what he was talking about, and he connected with people. He was a real person who connected with people. But he was the right person for the right time. And, you know, TV was just starting to emerge in those days. You know, again, we think about all these channels we watch and everything. I mean, I remember as a kid here in Rhode Island where there were 2 stations. And it was all black and white. In fact, our first TV was round. But I know, I'm really dating myself. Okay, so, you know, so we have to place him in that time frame.
Yes.
And for me, his leading in the financial responsibility and his leadership in terms of pushing the envelope to make the church more inclusive and people talking with one another. Those are the things I'll take away. You know, disappointed in some other stuff, but you know what? I'm going to leave people a lot of disappointed in some of the things I did in my life too. I mean, it's just the way it is. We're all human.
So you know, you talk about his role really in that evangelical movement coming out after World War II. When did we really see, because when we talk about the evangelicals, we often talk hand in hand with politics. When did evangelical, basically, religion become synonymous with political activism as well?
So when I was growing up as a child, you didn't talk about politics. You know, church people and politics were totally separate. The two didn't meet, especially in the conservative community. In the more progressive communities where there was a fight for social justice, you had political engagement, but not on the conservative side. Along came the moral majority and Jerry Falwell.
Okay.
And when they started bringing that together, and then people like Pat Robertson came along and joined in. And so it was that moral majority movement that really started to bring the evangelical group together. The evangelical church, I believe, is making the same mistake that the more progressive mainline church made. The mistake that the progressive, more mainline church made was they got too cozy with the Democratic Party and sometimes defended Democrats when they shouldn't have been defended. What's happening today, in my view, is that the evangelical community has become too closely aligned with the Republican Party, and goodness sake, they are defending Donald Trump. I mean, how in the world is that happening, right? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Hopefully they'll learn that lesson. As people of faith, we need to speak to issues and to policies and not get too cozy and too embedded with any one political party, or else we lose our credibility and we lose our integrity.
And let's talk a little bit about the money factor. Money has always been around with religion, back from the days of giving so much of your income to the Catholic Church, but how did the evangelicals get so much money?
So a big part of the evangelical movement has been tithing. And so many of the people are very faithful, and they give 10% of their income to their local church and then share it with other groups. There have been many, and you know, Graham, you know, for example, was one of the first to pioneer this, but there was a thing that originally came up called Living Letters by a fellow by the name of Taylor. And what it basically was a paraphrase, a contemporizing of the New Testament epistles. And he offered that as a premium if people sent in a certain amount of money. And people loved that. They loved that Living Letters because, you know, up until that time, everybody was reading the King James Bible. So you'd read these words like fornication and other stuff. You go, what is that, right? Well, when you read Living Letters, it said sex. And, you go, and I remember as a 14-year-old going, oh, okay, I get that. It's talking about something that's in my life, right?
So it resonated.
Yeah, exactly. And so it resonated with a lot of people. And so, you know, they became very sophisticated in terms of raising money. And I think a lot of people believed in Graham. Someone told me years ago, nobody ever gives money to an organization, they give to a person. And I think in the religious community that is particularly true, that there is someone who captures the imagination and trust of other people, and then they give to that person. And for the most part, I think Billy Graham deserved that trust that people gave him.
So are you surprised, not surprised, at the sort of media reaction today? He was a larger-than-life figure. I mean, is this a moment in American history?
Well, I think it is, and we're really passing from an era of what I would call almost religious innocence in a certain sense. I mean, Graham related to both Republican and Democratic presidents He didn't go there with a political agenda per se. He was there really on a personal piety mission. I respect that. That was maybe appropriate for the time. However, I would say, but you know what? God has called us to stand for certain values related to justice. And so maybe he said some things to people in private. We don't know. I mean, that was also the days of things kept in private. I mean, we didn't know until years later about the secret things that happened during the Kennedy administration in terms of his personal life. Because in those days, those things didn't get reported on. So it was a very different day. And there's a lot that we don't know. And I hope that along at some point, somebody can look back and really dig in and find out what happened, both the good, the bad, and the in-between. But on balance, I think he was a great American. I think he was a great faith leader, and he's somebody who I hold in high esteem.
And so just want to finish up with you here. You talk about his legacy, you talk about his son, and you talk about where he's going with his religious direction. Do you have concerns about certain facets of the evangelical community being so exclusionary of other religions? And where do things stand in that regard?
So this is an issue that has been part of the Christian church from its inception, how we relate to other religious traditions for a number of years, because Christianity was so dominant in the United States, so overwhelmingly dominant, that we didn't think much about interreligious activity. In fact, when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, he talked about Christian children and Jewish children being together. In those days, that was interreligious, right? That was it. Today we have a plurality of religious expressions. Christians are no longer they're still dominant, but not the way they were before. And we need to be thinking about how we relate to other traditions. And I think one of the things it takes to do that is theological humility. I think we have to think to ourselves and say, maybe I don't know everything, and maybe I have to open myself up to learn from someone else and appreciate from their tradition, and that I don't have all of the answers. But for some of us in the Christian sandbox, that's a real problem.
And so finally, while I have you in here, an issue that has been persisting now in this country, unfortunately, is the issue of gun violence. And
Yes.
we see it at churches, we see it at schools, we see it in public places. Just had Representative Greg Morey from East Providence talking about making schools safer. I know we've talked about this issue in the past as well. It happens every time there is a mass shooting. And I know you've had some things that you want to say about it.
Yeah, so I think it's very important that congregations and ushers and people who work in congregations be aware of things like situational awareness and some other strategies to help keep things calm. However, as a council of churches and personally, we do not endorse bringing concealed weapons into a space of worship. Worship space should be safe space. That means it's theologically and emotionally safe. The presence of guns, I think, has no place at all in a house of worship, and they just need to be out of there. Should someone come in, and fortunately, the number of shootings we've had within congregations and house of worship has been somewhat minimal, and I hope it stays that way. But if we start bringing in guns, we start frisking people or going through metal detectors, what the message we're going to send is that you're really not welcome here. If you're a distressed person, look, a lot of our ministry is with people who are depressed, who are going through difficult times in their lives. We don't want to put up any walls to say, we don't want to talk with you. That's antithetical to our whole mission. And so we have to be a little courageous ourselves and be willing to say, we'll take reasonable risk. We're not going to try and make ourselves totally safe, because that becomes counter then to a whole purpose for being.
And so you talk about addressing the downtrodden, the folks who have mental issues, and we've seen so much of the argument and the debate. Is there more mental illness today than there has been in the past? Is that the case? I mean, from people that you see at the religious perspective, people who come to churches looking for help, looking for faith, is 2018 different than 1980, different than 1950?
So, I was around in the 50s, but I wasn't ministering then, so I can't talk about it. So the few times I get to say I wasn't doing that. But anyway, I think the point is this. I don't know that there's more or less. My guess is there probably isn't any more. However, we have developed the ability for people who feel the need to seek help to go get that help. And so people who before may have kind of stayed behind the scenes are not coming out to get that help. My concern is that as we talk about mental health issues, that we be very thoughtful about how we talk about it so that we don't drive people back, behind the wall so they're not getting the help we need. That'll be totally counterproductive because there's a lot of people who need the help, get the help, and then they don't do anything that's irrational or harmful. But if we don't encourage them to get that help, then we've got a problem. And I have a real problem with a president who says, we're going to talk about mental health, but who's trying to destroy the Affordable Care Act, who is cutting back on Medicaid and Medicare and cutting back on resources for people to get more mental health. That's totally bonkers.
And speaking of addressing mental health issues, again, as the head of the State Council of Churches with a myriad of religions here in the state, we've seen numbers that say more agnostic people in the country than ever before. Is there a call amongst churches to try to get people to come believe in a higher power and a faith when they're going through difficult times?
I think that the answer to that is yes, but, okay? A lot of our congregations have models of how they organize and worship that worked well in the middle of the 20th century. And even though the faith is the same, they haven't made the move in terms of how they worship and how they work and how inclusive they're going to be. So many congregations have become older, they've become more concerned about survival than they have about mission, and so we've got a lot of soul searching to do ourselves. However, I was in a class at CCRI just last week with 25 millennials, and all but 2 of them no longer went to any sort of worship service, even though they'd been raised in it. However, when we started talking about some things in a way that was different than they necessarily talked about it, all of a sudden there was engagement, there was conversation. I actually got a couple of really nice emails from people saying, maybe I need to go back and rethink this. So that's our hope.
The emergence here into the new era. Well, I appreciate your taking the time to come in today. Again, the passing of Billy Graham, so many myriad of issues just going on at the national level as well. We always appreciate having your perspective here, Don. So
Thanks,
thank
Kate.
You for coming
Always
in.
welcome.
Okay, we'll let you go. I know you're a busy guy.
Thank you. So long. Bye now.
Reverend Dr. Don Anderson wanted to bring him in.
Care.
Chatted with him this morning about Billy Graham, but talking about his legacy. Again, passing today at 99, so I appreciate Don taking the time to come into the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. We appreciate your tuning in and watching this News and Politics Hour. Molly O'Brien was filling in for Rick Simone at the 3 o'clock hour. She'll be back tomorrow at 3. I'll be back at 4, but be sure to tune in to Go Local Prov. A lot of news today. The Senate introduced a resolution to look to expel Senator Nick Kettle this next Tuesday. Is scheduled for a hearing in the Senate Judiciary. And then if you missed it, Go Local did break the news that Central Falls Mayor James Diosa gave a no-bid contract to former police chief here in Providence, Dean Esterman, for services in Central Falls. You can read all about that on Go Local Prov. So thank you for watching. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow. Be sure to catch us on Facebook, online, and then back in studio. I'm Go Local News Editor Kate Nagel.